Look at a map of the world right now, just for a second, and find tiny little strip of land connecting North and South America. That narrow piece of earth called Isthmus of Panama, because what happened there is one of the most jaw-dropping, heart-stopping, and genuinely unbelievable stories in all of human history. And the crazy thing is that most people walk past it without a second thought. But here's the part nobody talks about. That thin piece of land was once the most powerful wall on the entire planet. Not because it had armies or weapons or fortresses, but simply because it existed. Because for centuries, sailors looked at it and had only two choices. Sail the brutally long and dangerous route all the way around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America, where storms would tear ships apart and waves would swallow men whole, or stop the ship, unload everything onto land, drag it all across the jungle by foot and by mule, then reload it onto another ship on the other side, which was slow and expensive and dangerous in a completely different way. And you have to understand just how much this one geographic inconvenience shaped the entire world. It decided which empires got rich, which trade routes survived, which armies could move fast enough to win wars, and which merchants could afford to stay in business. But then one day, humanity looked at that wall and said, "We are going through it, not around it, not over it, but straight through the middle of it." And what followed was one of the most extraordinary, devastating, heroic, and frankly insane engineering adventures ever attempted by human beings on this planet. Now, you might think the story starts with the Americans, but here's the part that will genuinely surprise you. The first people crazy enough to try cutting a canal through Panama were the French. And they had every reason to believe they could do it, because just a few decades earlier, a brilliant French engineer named Ferdinand de Lesseps had pulled off what seemed like an impossible miracle by building the Suez Canal in Egypt, slicing right through the desert and connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. And the whole world had watched in astonishment as it actually worked. So when de Lesseps stood up and said he could do the same thing in Panama, people believed him, investors poured in money, workers signed up by the thousands, and the whole project was launched with enormous confidence and fanfare. But what happened next will genuinely shock you. Because Panama was not Egypt, not even slightly, and the difference was not just a matter of geography. It was a matter of life and death on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend today. Because the moment those workers set foot in the Panamanian jungle, they entered a world that seemed designed specifically to kill them. The heat was suffocating. The rain came down so hard and so fast that rivers could rise by several meters in just a few hours. The ground that looked solid in the morning could turn into flowing mud by afternoon. And the jungle itself seemed to push back against every shovel, every pickaxe, every attempt to impose human order on its ancient chaos. But here's the part that truly breaks your heart. The worst enemy was not the rain or the mud or the landslides. It was something so small, you could not even see it without a microscope. It was the mosquito. And specifically the diseases those mosquitoes carried. Yellow fever and malaria ripped through the workforce like wildfire. Men who had arrived healthy and strong would be dead within weeks, sometimes within days. The hospitals overflowed. The death tolls climbed into the thousands, and back in France, the newspapers tried to hide the true numbers because the reality was so horrifying that investors would have pulled out immediately if they had known the truth. And the truth was that the French project was not just struggling, it was dying. It was collapsing under the weight of disease and debt and a fundamentally flawed idea. Because de Lesseps had insisted on building a sea-level canal. The same approach that had worked in the flat Egyptian desert, but Panama is not flat. Panama has a ridge of rocky hills running right through the middle of it, and digging down to sea level through that ridge, while fighting landslides and floods and disease, was not just difficult. It was essentially impossible with the technology of the time. And so after years of agony and billions of francs lost and thousands of lives sacrificed, the French project collapsed entirely. And that failure was not just an engineering disaster, it was one of the biggest financial scandals in French history. Ruining ordinary investors who had put their savings into it, and leaving behind nothing but jungle, slowly reclaiming the rusting machines and the graves of the workers who had died trying. And what happened next will shock you, because into that wreckage stepped the United States. And for them, this was never just about trade. This was about power, raw global power. Because American military strategists had been watching the situation for years, and they understood something that most people still do not fully appreciate, which is that a country that controls the passage between two oceans controls the timing of everything, the speed of naval fleets, the cost of shipping goods, the ability to project military force to any corner of the globe, and America wanted that control desperately. But here is the part nobody talks about. Getting the chance to build the canal required one of the most audacious and morally complicated political maneuvers in American history. Because Panama was not its own country at that point, it was part of Colombia. And when the United States tried to negotiate a treaty with Colombia to gain the rights to build and operate the canal, the Colombian government said no. The deal was not good enough. And so what happened next has been debated by historians ever since. Because very shortly afterward, a group of Panamanian separatists declared independence from Colombia, and American warships conveniently appeared offshore to prevent Colombian troops from putting down the rebellion, and Panama became an independent nation almost overnight. And almost immediately, the brand new country signed a treaty giving the United States the right to build and operate the canal in a zone of land running right through the middle of the country. And you can make of that what you will, but the result was that America now had its chance, and they were absolutely determined not to repeat the French disaster. The first thing the Americans did was not pick up a shovel. This is the part that I think is the most underrated chapter of the entire story. Because before a single cubic meter of earth was moved, the Americans launched a war, not against another country, but against the mosquito, and specifically against the diseases that mosquitoes spread. And this might sound simple from where we stand today, but at the time it was genuinely revolutionary. Because the understanding that mosquitoes transmitted diseases like yellow fever and malaria was brand new science. Barely a decade old, and plenty of people still did not believe it. But the Americans committed to it completely. They drained swamps and standing water across the entire zone. They sprayed oil on every puddle they could find. They installed screens on windows and doors. They fumigated buildings. They quarantined sick workers. They built proper hospitals with clean water and sanitation. And the results were almost miraculous. The death rates from yellow fever and malaria dropped dramatically. Workers stopped dying at the catastrophic rate that had doomed the French. And suddenly, you could actually keep a workforce alive long enough to build something. And here is the thing that gets me every time. Without that mosquito campaign, nothing else would have mattered. All the engineering genius and all the American money and all the determination in the world would have been worthless if the workers kept dying. The mosquito was the real boss of Panama, and the Americans beat it before they even started digging. But here's the part nobody talks about. The engineering breakthrough that truly made the canal possible was actually changing the entire concept of what the canal was supposed to be, because the Americans did what the French had refused to do. They abandoned the idea of a sea-level canal and instead designed something that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. They decided to build a canal that went up before it went down. They would use a series of massive locks, essentially giant water elevators, to lift ships up from the ocean to an enormous artificial lake sitting in the middle of the isthmus, and sail them across that lake, and then lower them back down the other side into the other ocean. And this single decision changed everything, because instead of having to dig all the way down to sea level through that central ridge of rock and hills, they only needed to dig enough to create the lake and the channel through the ridge at the higher elevation, which was still an absolutely colossal task, but actually achievable. And then there was the lake itself. Lake Gatun, which was created by building a massive dam across the Chagres River. And here's the beautiful twist. That river had been one of the biggest problems the French faced, because it flooded constantly and unpredictably and destroyed months of work in a single afternoon. But the Americans turned that problem into the solution. They dammed the river, flooded a huge valley, and created what was, at the time, the largest artificial lake in the entire world. And that lake did not just solve the flooding problem. It became the central navigable section of the canal itself, and it provided all the fresh water needed to operate the locks. And now we need to talk about the locks, because the locks are where the real magic happens. And once you understand how they work, you will never stop being amazed by them. So picture this. A ship the size of several city blocks pulls up to a massive concrete chamber. The gates close behind it. And then water begins to pour in through enormous pipes and tunnels built into the walls of the chamber. No pumps, no engines, just pure gravity doing the work. And slowly, steadily, the water rises and the ship rises with it, floating up like a toy in a bathtub until it reaches the level of the next section of the canal. Then the gates in front open and the ship moves forward into the next chamber, and the process repeats. And at the other end of the canal, the same thing happens in reverse. The chambers drain instead of fill, and the ship descends back down to ocean level. And the total height difference the ships travel is about 26 meters, which sounds modest until you are standing next to a fully loaded container ship, the length of 3 football fields being lifted like it weighs nothing. And what makes this even more extraordinary is that it has been working continuously since 1914. The same basic mechanism, gravity moving water, water moving ships, day after day, decade after decade. But you will not believe what came next, because even after the locks were designed and the lake was planned, there was still the small matter of actually digging through the central ridge of rock. The section that became known as the Culebra Cut or the Gaylord Cut. And this was where the canal truly tried to break the people building it, because this was not soft jungle soil. This was hard volcanic rock sitting under unstable slopes that had been absorbing tropical rain for millions of years. And every single day the workers would blast and dig and haul away millions of cubic meters of material using explosives and steam shovels and an army of trains running on temporary tracks. And every single day the slopes would slide back down and fill in what had just been dug. Sometimes dramatically, sometimes with sudden massive landslides that buried equipment and workers without warning. And the numbers involved are almost impossible to hold in your head. Over 200 million cubic meters of material were removed from this cut alone, enough to fill a line of dump trucks stretching halfway around the planet. And the human cost was staggering. Hundreds of workers died in accidents and explosions and landslides. And the psychological toll on the engineers and supervisors who watched it happen was enormous. But here's the part that gets me. They kept going. Every single day they came back and they dug again. And slowly, painfully, year after year, the cut deepened and widened until finally the two ends connected, and you could see the sky at the bottom of that trench and know that 2 oceans were about to meet. When the Panama Canal officially opened in August of 1914, the world genuinely changed overnight, and not in a small way. Shipping routes that had taken weeks were cut to days. The cost of moving goods between the east and west coasts of the Americas dropped dramatically. Naval fleets that had been strategically divided between 2 oceans could now move between them in hours. Ports and trade routes and supply chains that had been organized around the old geography suddenly had to reorganize themselves around the new one. And the ripple effects spread out across the global economy in ways that are still shaping the world we live in today. Because once you change the geography of trade, you change everything downstream from it. Which industries survive, which cities grow, which countries get rich, which routes matter. And here's the thing that most people never think about. The canal has never stopped being strategically and economically critical. Not for a single day in over 100 years. It just keeps working. Keep lifting ships, keep saving days, keep shifting the balance of global trade. But here is the part nobody talks about. The canal has a vulnerability that has nothing to do with politics or engineering. Its vulnerability is rain, because those locks do not run on electricity or diesel or any modern fuel. They run on fresh water, and that fresh water comes from rainfall filling Lake Gatun and the other reservoirs. And every single time a ship passes through the canal, it uses millions of liters of fresh water that flow out into the ocean and are gone. So if rainfall decreases, if the dry season runs long, if climate patterns shift, the Canal Authority has to start limiting the number of ships that can pass through each day. And this is happening more frequently. And it is a reminder that for all its steel and concrete and engineering genius, the Panama Canal is ultimately a creature of nature, dependent on weather patterns that humans did not create and cannot fully control. And the story of who controls the canal is its own extraordinary chapter, because for most of the 20th century, the United States controlled it completely, operating it out of what was essentially American territory running right through the middle of a foreign country. And the tension this created with Panama and with the broader Latin American world was enormous and complicated and sometimes violent. And then in 1977, the United States and Panama signed a treaty agreeing to transfer control of the canal to Panama. And on the last day of 1999, in one of those rare moments of genuine historical significance, The Panamanian flag was raised, and the canal became fully Panamanian. It's managed by the Panama Canal Authority, and today it is one of the most important single sources of revenue for the entire country. And in 2016, something remarkable happened that showed the canal was not done surprising the world, because after years of construction and billions of dollars of investment, a new set of much larger locks opened alongside the original ones, capable of handling ships almost 3 times the size of what the original locks could accommodate. The so-called Neo-Panamax vessels that carry enormous quantities of container cargo, and suddenly the canal was relevant in a whole new way for a whole new era of global trade. The Panama Canal is a wound cut into the skin of the planet, an act of human will so enormous and so costly that it is almost beyond comprehension. Built by workers who died in the thousands from disease and accidents and exhaustion, designed by engineers who solved problems that had never been solved before, fought over by nations who understood that whoever controls the passage between 2 oceans controls something fundamental about the world, and today it sits there quietly doing its work, lifting ships, draining chambers, saving days, shifting the weight of global commerce from one side of the planet to the other. And the most extraordinary thing about it is not the engineering or the politics or even the human cost. It is the simple fact that it exists at all, that human beings looked at a wall between 2 oceans and decided with absolute seriousness that the wall had to go. And then they went and removed it, and the world has never been the same since. And somewhere out there right now, at this very moment, a ship the size of a city block is being slowly lifted 26 meters into the air by nothing but water. And gravity and the accumulated stubbornness of every single person who refused to accept that some obstacles are permanent